Good morning, everyone. My name is Professor Pierre Nguimkeu. I'm the director of the Africa Growth Initiative and a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program here at Brookings. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all today in today's event for what I'm sure will be a fascinating and informative discussion around a roadmap for growth, or how a quarter century of African development can prepare us for the future. I would like to thank those of you that are here in person today, as well as those joining us online from Africa and across the globe through our live streaming. The Africa Growth Initiative was the first Africa program focused on Africa in Washington, D.C., when it launched its activity in 2008, and has consistently produced quality policy research in support of Africa's sustainable development and growth, as well as a mutually beneficial US-Africa relationship. In keeping with this focus, we are happy to take this opportunity with our friends at the World Bank to reflect on 25 years of African development and look forward to how key stakeholders can maintain momentum and overcome challenges as we go further into the 21st century. In the year 2000, the World Bank published a volume titled, "Can Africa Claim the 21st Century?" This was a flagship report examining how Africa could create wealth and harness its potential for development. But the world has changed since 2000 in both expected and unexpected ways, from digital revolution to COVID-19 pandemic. Today's events build on a new volume, 21st Century Africa, Governance and Growth, which offers a renewed and rigorous assessment of Africa's development trajectory over the last 25 years, drawing on evidence, experience, and foresight. This volume is not just a retrospective. It's a forward-looking roadmap for inclusive, sustainable, and resilient growth on the continent. Over the last 25 years, Africa has made real progress on education, health, connectivity, and political transitions. But the road ahead demands even more ambition. We face persistent structural changes in governance, industrial transformation, and human capital development. As one of the contributors to the chapters on industrialization, I am proud that this report recognizes the importance of industrial policy, not as a relic of the past, but as a critical instrument for building Africa's economic sovereignty in a rapidly changing global landscape. We must not replicate yesterday's path. We must build our own centered on the capabilities of our people, our regional integration, and our technological potential. I want to take a moment to extend special recognition to Dr. Chorching Goh, who is a lead economist at the World Bank and the lead editor of this volume. Her vision, dedication, and leadership throughout this process were exceptional. She brought together a talented team of scholars and practitioners, fostered rich collaboration, and ensured that the report addresses Africa's realities with nuances and clarity. We are honored to have Chorching with us today, and I am delighted that she will kick off the program with a presentation of the report's key findings and main policy messages. Following that, we will have a panel discussion moderated by my distinguished colleague, Professor Landry Signé, who is a senior fellow at the Africa Growth Initiative here at Brookings, editor-in-chief of the 2025 Foresight Africa Report, host of the Brookings Foresight podcast, and co-chair of the World Economic Forum Regional Action Group for Africa. Professor Signé has been instrumental in elevating policy dialogue on the continent and beyond, and we are fortunate to have him guide today's conversation. We are also joined by an outstanding panel of speakers, Dr. Diame Diop, Regional Vice President for Eastern and Southern Africa at the World Bank Group, who brings decades of policy experience and deep knowledge of the continent's economic landscape. Professor Adrienne Lebas, Associate Professor at American University School of Public Affairs, whose research on political institutions and accountability in Africa is both timely and insightful. And currently, Professor Lebas is actually carrying over a very interesting fieldwork in Nigeria. Her Excellency, Hilda Suka Mafudze, African Union Ambassador, to the United States, who represent the voice of Africa's collective leadership and vision on the global stage. Together, they will reflect on the key messages of the report and offer their perspective on how Africa can shape its future with agency, resilience, and strategic partnership. Before I close, let me thank our communication staff at Brookings and our dedicated team, our dedicated AGI team, for all their work behind the scenes to make this event possible. I also extend my gratitude to the World Bank team for stewarding this effort, and to my fellow co-authors for their dedication to rigor, clarity, and purpose. May this roadmap help us shape an African century on our own terms and for our shared future. Without further ado, I will now turn the podium to Chorching for her presentation. Over to you, Chorching. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. On behalf of our report team, I would like to thank our colleagues in the Brookings for organizing this event. We hope that this report actually opens conversations and debates, starting with our distinguished panel later. As Pierre has mentioned, this is a sequel report to the one that at the turn of the century, the World Bank Group had produced. And he had already mentioned one highlight of the report, which was that we have a large team of knowledgeable and experienced experts writing this report. And I want to mention that we have a website of the profiles and all the background materials of the authors, as well as the whole production process of this report. So feel free to reach out to individual experts or look through how we come about with this report. A second highlight I want to mention about this report is that in 2000, World Bank was a major player on the continent. But today we are one of many. And therefore, in the early stages of this report's production, Andrew Dabalen, our chief economist of the Africa region at the World Bank, had held many consultations with our development partners and had seminars and discussions with policy think tanks on the continent, as well as in fora with experts and people interested in growth and development of Africa. And this report benefits immensely from these insights, and we incorporate a lot of their contributions in the report. And so this is the second highlight of the report. And so in 2000, the report identified 4 areas in order for Africa to claim the 21st century. So one is to reduce conflict and improve governance. Second, invest in our people. 3, the third one is transform our economies out of low-value agriculture. And the 4th and last one would be to reduce aid dependence and debt. So how have we done after 25 years? Well, there were some bright spots that, macroeconomy was managed better, and we have some successful democratic secessions in a number of countries, and we do see improvement in human capital outcomes. But also during this period, we saw that political violence had multiplied 8 times, and the region has experienced greater fragility and insecurity from the Sahel all the way to the Horn of Africa. And when we looked at the human capital index that the World Bank has compiled across quite a number, close to 100 plus countries, we found that a child born in Africa today is only expected to reach just 40% of their full potential. And for the economy, the sectoral transformation is painfully slow, and a huge proportion of employment still happens in the agriculture sector. And lastly, we also found that actually sovereign debt has doubled during this period. So the picture was not very promising, and we know that economies can't grow without gains in productivity And Paul Krugman famously said that productivity is not everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. So now let's take a look. So in 1960, Africa's labor productivity was 10% of that of the United States. And after 60 years, what we found that it has even fallen a couple of percentage points below from from what it was in 1960. And what happened was that in 1960, South Asia and East Asia's labor productivity level was half of Africa's average. And today, for East Asia, it's more than double, and for South Asia is 1.5 times more. And when we look at individual countries in Africa, we also found that many of them had stagnated in terms of productivity, and for many countries, actually, the levels that we had for the latest data in 2020 showed that it was actually worse or lower than in 1970. So this is the situation. But all is not lost. There is still a chance that, there's still a chance for seizing this century for African economies. And what happened is that at the turn of the century, there are many events that were not anticipated. And these created greater opportunities for Africa. One is that we did not expect the rise of China's involvement on the continent, and and not just China, but subsequently with others, we saw that Turkey, the Middle East, and increasingly India is involved and interested in investing and trading with Africa. So we have devoted a couple of chapters, one in particular, in discussing how African economies can harness these partnerships with the other countries that are interested in investing and trading with Africa. And for example, that in today's very fragmented world, where trade barriers keep rising, that it is a bright spot that we find that we had actually ratified the Pan-Africa Free Trade Agreement. And in the report, we also devoted a couple of chapters discussing how the economies can make use of this opportunity to integrate with the global value chains. And lastly, we know that during these 25 years, this digital revolution that swept the world and the continent certainly had benefited African economies that earlier developers did not have. And we have also chapters in the report, discussing how to make the best of this digital revolution for African economies. And lastly, the unanticipated impacts from climate change are certainly more devastating are certainly more devastating than anticipated, but it also created an opportunity for Africa to be part of this global solution to green energy transition. And again, we devote a lot of efforts and the focus on discussing this in the report. So, well, we can see that in the 4 areas that was identified to be very important at the turn of the century remain to be very important and actually even more pressing today. But not only that we also have found that there are also unanticipated mega trends that are sweeping the continent that African economies can better harness to its advantage. And very sorry, in today's TikTok era, that we as a team produce several 100 pages of text that you guys have to forgive us, but we hope that the report actually can serve as a mini handbook to executable policy measures in important areas for the African economies. And if you will allow me to distill what we found into 3 ingredients that are most important for Africa to grow at a sufficiently high rate for a sufficiently long period of time would be that, one, they will need a committed, a credible, and a competent state. Second, they need capable citizens, skilled, educated, healthy Africans who can take advantage of the economic opportunities with entrepreneurial spirit and lots of ambition and drive. And third, competitive markets. Contestable markets will fuel growth, job creation, and unlock opportunities on the continent. In 1960, I'm just going to end this by giving a little story that in 1960, South Korea was at a per capita GDP of 10% of the United States then, all right? And South Korea has grown 6% a year for 60 years. And today, South Korea has reached 50% of the per capita GDP of the United States. And South Korea, in 1960, a per capita GDP of about 1,200 was actually poorer than quite a number of countries on the continent of Africa. But today, it is actually at 35,000 per capita GDP. And when we look back, we would say that one is that actually South Korea isn't in a very friendly neighborhood with its hostile northern neighbor, as well as a former colonizer across the ocean, and a rising China who is friendly with its hostile north neighbor. But what South Korea has done was that its government and people were extremely ambitious and determined. And in the 60s and 70s, they invest a lot in human capital and physical capital. They try very hard to make its economy very efficient. And so I still think that there is much that, Africa economies can do, especially within its own border. And actually, there's so much the government can still deliver. And I would like to end by saying that we are not trying to say that we get it all right, but we just hope that this report actually opens conversations and debates on these important development issues for Africa continent. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I don't hear the African energy here. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I love this. So I'm Landry Signé, and Professor Nguimkeu already introduced me, so I will not extend. The challenge of starting an event is that you cannot self-introduce yourself. So Professor Nguimkeu is really a distinguished scholar. We are very fortunate to have you as the director of the Africa Growth Initiative and connecting really the dot between academia and also global institution. But let me start by saying that we should give a round of applause to Dr. Chorching for her amazing presentation with incredible insight. Today is very special. It's a special day for me, and because Can Africa Claim the 21st Century is a report which is prominently cited in my first academic publication over 2 decades ago. I released in 2004. And this was particularly important because at the time I was already showing how the report was shaping development strategies in Africa, development priorities on the continent. So I could not agree more with the analysis, and also I expect the new report, 21st Century Africa Governance and Growth, to have the same type of impact. But for this, we have distinguished panelists who will share with us about how to bridge the fantastic ideas which were shared and the actual implementation impact on the ground on the continent. Of course, we have Dr. Diame Diop, Regional Vice President for Eastern, South, and Southern Africa at the World Bank. Everyone was already introduced, so I will just name them very quickly. We also have Dr. Adrienne Lebas, Associate Professor at the American University School of Public Affairs, and Her Excellency Hilda Suka-Mafudze, Ambassador of the African Union to the United States, who we love to call Mother Africa in North America and in the Americas in general, because since she came to Washington, D.C., the relation between Africa and the U.S. have never been better. So thank you so much for being with us today. Let me start with Vice President Diame. How has the role of the World Bank in Africa in African development change in the past 25 years, and how are you preparing to address the emerging challenges over the next quarter of century?
That's a very good, good question, and I'm very happy to reflect on it and to share some thoughts. In fact, 2000 was also the year I joined the bank. And I remember very well this report, Can Africa Claim the 21st Century? And as a young African joining the bank, as a young professional, I was extremely interested in what the report was saying, the messages. And in fact, just last year in Nigeria, one of the co-authors of the report, Governor Soludo, came to see me and then gave me the report. And I had to tell him this was a must-read for me 20 years ago. When I look, the bank has really evolved in its support to developing countries in line with the challenges, the evolution of the challenges, the needs on the ground, the opportunities as well. And if I look at the last 25 years, I think we have evolved toward more country ownership. Everything we do in any country is governed by what we call a country partnership strategy, which is an intersection between what the priorities of the governments are and what the World Bank can offer in terms of support. So I think that's really something that is quite significant, and I've seen it strengthen over time. Second, we are more result-based than before. In fact, one of the growing instruments we're using in our programs is result-based financing. Third, we are more integrated, and it's even more so now within the bank. The bank has many different sub-institutions, if you want, different parts. And right now, the integration of the support we're providing to private sector through IFC and MIGA, and the support we're providing to government is much, much more integrated. And we even want to really go further in integrating that support. The bank has been a knowledge bank, as you all know, for a long time. But I think over time, there was a deliberate effort in leveraging the bank as a knowledge bank. And for someone like me who spent a long time in East Asia, in fact, the majority of my career was spent on the ground in many countries in East Asia, they value the knowledge bank much more than the financing bank. And then when I moved to Africa, I think the financing part of the bank is more prominent partly because of what, the sort of challenges these countries are facing. Although, even in Africa, one of our biggest contribution is to really provide knowledge. And to generate knowledge, working with various institutions, one of the key particularities of the bank is that, as Chorching mentioned earlier, we don't produce the knowledge just alone. We collaborate with a large numbers of stakeholders across the globe. We try to get the best experts on the different subject matters to contribute to our reports. Mm-hmm. And we use that report to really underpin our policy dialogue on the ground and to support government on reforms. So those are some of the key things that I think I can emphasize as highlight over the last 25 years. Now, because we are knowledge-driven, we all know what some of the mega trends that will shape Africa in the next 25 years are. The biggest one is demographics. In the next 25 years, essentially, the active labor force, the share of the population in working age in Africa will double to 1.3 billion. And 90% of the growth in global labor force will come from Africa. This is because while population growth is shrinking in many countries, or will shrink in many countries, in Africa, the population growth will keep growing. So, which basically means that whether we succeed in development or not will be to a large part determined by the extent to which we help African countries to create more and better jobs. The job agenda has become an essential component of what we do at the World Bank. It relates to many things that Chorching mentioned earlier, and I can come to it later. But we see three key pillars. One is, at the fundamental level, Africa will not be able to transform itself if it doesn't close its infrastructure gap and its human capital gap. This is very critical. So investment in infrastructure, connectivity, power, electricity, digital connectivity, transport corridors is absolutely essential to transform the economy. And in addition to that, investment in education, health, skills development, those are foundational things that actually you need to really get to the next level. Second is really improving the business environment. There's a lot of potential in Africa. You look at every African countries, you are struck by how much potential is there, whether it's mining wealth, whether it's tourism, whether it's agribusiness, you name it. But for Africa to leverage that potential and to realize that potential, you need to create an enabling environment for a tidal wave of private investment to come in and be invested in Africa. So this is so critical. And what is preventing that from happening is just the regulatory and policy barriers to investment that we see in many countries. So that's the second pillar. And the third one is to really engage with the private sector, combine assets and resources to really co-invest with the private sector. Because in some areas, private sector would not invest without some level of public investment. And that's where actually at the World Bank, we are trying to, that integration that I mentioned, to work with IFC and MIGA to de-risk investment in some areas and to reduce the cost of investment so that private sector can come in. So in a nutshell, those are some of the key challenges and opportunities that we see in the coming years.
Yes, Jamie, I really like how you provided a really comprehensive picture, even preempting some of my follow-up question, but I will come back to you very, very soon. Professor Adrienne, many of the recommendations we have heard today require African government to invest much more in infrastructure and human capital, among others. How have government tried to increase government revenues, and how can the need for those increase of government revenue could also match with the imperative of addressing the concerns of the citizens?
Yeah, it's a really big question. And, we've already talked about the amount of resource mobilization that's going to be needed to improve services, build infrastructure, jobs creation with the growth of the labor force. And we haven't really talked about fiscal constraints. Yeah. And, public debt at this point is now reached 56% of the continent's GDP. Governments are spending an enormous, really way too much of their budgets on debt servicing. And then I encourage everyone to read the report. It's fantastic. But I was really struck by the over 40 billion a year that will be needed to do climate change mitigation and reach the NDCs. So, we're dealing with a real kind of fiscal crunch. And tax revenue is probably, one of the tools that's really going to be need to be scaled up in order to meet that challenge. The report does note that there's been, I would say, a very modest increase in tax mobilization on the continent. What has that looked like? I would guess that the bulk of that is coming from value-added tax, which has been rolled out and is now an important ingredient of government's internally generated revenue. There's also been improvements in customs, the effectiveness of customs collection, some digitization, and information technology has probably increased tax mobilization. But I think we just can't really look at the next 50 years without talking about a massive expansion in direct taxation. And by that, I mean property and income tax. And the World Bank and the IMF are really interested in this area. African governments are really interested in already experimenting in this area. I've been very privileged to work for many years now in Lagos and closely with Lagos state government, which I think is one of the success stories in terms of increasing revenue for the state government through income tax, which is considered an impossible task in sub-Saharan Africa. But the bulk of that revenue that they've been able to collect is from the formal sector. So, we need to talk about how we can increase tax compliance in the informal sector. And I think Landry's question is really about how do you do that without creating too heavy a burden on poor Africans? And those of us who've worked on the continent for decades know about the way that local government taxation often works. Indiscriminate, very coercive, and often, just not really focused on creating a good bureaucratic and regulatory environment, not creating trust amongst citizens. But I think there is a way of doing direct taxation that would be better than what we're doing with VAT, which is regressive, and would also do two things that I think we can only do with direct taxation, which is, first of all, increase government accountability. We know that citizens, when they're taxed, are more likely to make demands on government and more likely to actually monitor government performance. But then the second thing, which I don't think is talked about, the report and just generally the World Bank policy over the past 20 years, I think the focus is right. It's on how do you create functional states? States that have bureaucratic capacity due to services delivery, bureaucratic capacity to create the regulatory environment that we need for private sector development. And historically, we know that mass taxation is how you create that bureaucratic capacity. And so I think to the extent that African governments can figure out how to formalize the informal sector and extract revenue, that means they're also going to be building the bureaucratic capacity that they can use for services delivery and creating a rule of law. I'll say it's super hard. And I think that our public policy now on how to do that kind of direct taxation is not great. And maybe I can talk more about that.
Absolutely, and perhaps a quick follow-up on this. We have seen what happened in Kenya after the attempt of government to increase taxation. So what will be your reaction in this type of context?
So everyone thinks about last year's Kenya protests around the budget bill that came out, which And Kenya has been engaged, particularly under decentralization, in a massive increase in tax mobilization, particularly at the county level. And there's been a lot of resistance to that. I don't just think of Kenya, though. I think of the 2011 Occupy Nigeria protests. Goodluck Jonathan tried to get rid of the fuel subsidy, which Tinubu has now been able to do. And that was 25% of the government budget was being spent on the fuel subsidy, and large-scale protests made it impossible. He had to reverse himself. And that really constrained the Nigerian government for more than a decade now to do development work. So, I think that protest is going to be part of the process. But I think that's why it's very important to come up with good policy solutions that sort of create societal buy-in to the sort of fiscal exchange that we want to create.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Adrienne. Excellency, the African Union marks over 2 decades since its official launch, of course, as the predecessor of the Organization for African Unity. And how do you assess the AU's role in driving Africa's development agenda in general and regional integration in particular?
Thank you, Prof. Senior. And let me begin by saying, from the time I started in this job, when I ended this job, it was very exciting, impressive, and it was all to say, we have put the policy frameworks in place for Africa to develop, for Africa to get to certain points. When I talk of Agenda 2063, to me, I'll still call it a blueprint, an economic blueprint for Africa. Having been a player also in politics as a politician, and driving my mindset into saying to myself, there's no way Africa can develop without growing its economies. In the Agenda 2063, which was put in place in 2013, for those who may not know, and it gave a 50-year plan to say by 2063, this is what Africa will have done. Of course, it came up with its own flagships, and the one active flagship at the moment is the AFCFTA, which is strictly right now working on the integration, working on coming up with also its policies which strengthen the direction that we would want to take, like the payment systems. Those are some of the protocols, and the protocols on the young people and the women. And we have seen that without the women, without the youth being incorporated in these policy frameworks, we will not achieve, which is what Chorching also mentioned, that the human capital, strengthening this human capital will make a difference. The demography that the professor here has mentioned, it says a lot that Africa has shaped itself, has put on the table the policy frameworks and said, for those who want to work with us, you can come on board and we can make a difference. And this is who we are, and this is who we are, and what we are worth, and the direction that we would want to take as Africa. And with that, we have had those policy frameworks. We have had the governance getting better, though with challenges here and there that were mentioned a little earlier. But we have seen that as it comes to peace and security and stability, the people of Africa have it in themselves right now to say, we would want to be peaceful. We would want to work on our development. How do you work on the development without peace? How do you do peace without development? It has become a very dicey question. And we have seen a lot of coups taking place on the continent. But I've said where things are happening, where there's activities happening, of course, there are all those also pullbacks. But I think Africans have taken it within themselves to say, we're not going to be pulled back, we're going to move on and make a difference that we would want to get into. And I may also mention that as we have experienced during COVID time, not getting the, what do you call it? The COVID-19 treatment has taught us a lesson. Of course, some of it is us waking up to like, okay, how do we take care of our populations? How can you take care of your family? Then when someone has to be coming in to ensure your family is well fed. So we have started putting together manufacturing for vaccines, exactly, for vaccines, for our population. To me, Africa has shaped in a rightful trajectory, of course, with the help of the World Bank and other institutions. We also believe as African Union, we believe in partnering, working with partners, but at the same time, we are really railing to integrate. And how do we integrate without infrastructure?
Yeah.
In all sectors, talk of digital, talk of the roads that Professor also mentioned. How do we get there? All these things need to be addressed. And the implementation of AFC, FTA, then we'll see glory. But we are holding on. We are moving. We are making a difference. And we are ensuring that young demography will inherit a stronger Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Excellency. I think that's you really emphasize the intentionality of the African Union in being directing its own destiny. Vice President Jami, so as Chorching has eloquently presented, since the publication of the previous report, the global economic landscape has shifted significantly with the critical importance of, especially in Africa, of China, Asia in general, numerous countries in the Middle East, also in Latin America, in Mount Order. So how can African countries more strategically navigate this diversification of global partnerships to accelerate their development, but also prevent challenges such as commodity dependencies or debt crisis?
Yes, I think indeed Africa has a lot of things that the rest of the world wants and needs, right? One of them is the people. The other one is natural resources, but also one key source of opportunities for investors globally is that, you know, the last frontier in terms of region where the gaps are so large and the investment opportunities are so ample is Africa, right? Think about the experiment of adding one additional road in the US. The marginal benefit of that is relatively low, right? But in Africa, because of the gap, the marginal benefit of investing in infrastructure is huge. It's very transformative. And this is where, if you are in global investors and you want to really seek opportunities for investment, that's the continent to go. Now, and I think that's what explains, in part, this rapid diversification of partnership and of external partner. It's a great opportunity for Africa to not only close its infrastructure gap, but also for trade, for finance, for technology, etc. However, Africa needs to really strengthen its domestic policy framework to be able to maximize the benefit of that. It's not all about investment and money. It's really about how do you put those resources to good use so that your population, your local population benefit. So I think it's really important to think strategically about those partnerships. How do you come up with win-win partnership for the benefit of the people? And how do you strengthen the governance and the policies so that those benefits will be widely shared? So I think this is really critical. Now, there are a few technicalities. We've seen how some countries have put together mechanisms to attract more investment, but also to spread the benefit to countries. Special economic zones are one example. There are also some very strategic partnership that could be had in some key sectors, such as the mining sectors. Africa has 40%, I think, of the global reserves in some of the critical mining, such as cobalt, manganese, and so on, are in Africa. And those are so critical for the green transition globally. They're also so important for the sort of global technological sector, because those are inputs coming into the fabrication of cell phones, but also PV, solar panels, and so on. So there is an opportunity for a win-win partnership between Africa that has those resources and global investors and partners that want to use those resources to support the green transition, for example. And we at the World Bank have a very strategic approach to it, because for some countries in Africa, you do have the infrastructure, you do have the local conditions for those investments to be enabled quite naturally. Maybe South Africa is one example. But for many countries, the mineral resources are there, but there's no road to get there, right? So you need to invest in the road, you need to invest in electricity supply, right? So that you reduce the cost of exploiting those resources, and you de-risk those investments. And you need to also invest preemptively before those private investment in the mining happen, in ensuring that the local population would benefit. Invest in their education, invest in their connectivity, so that when those investments materialize, they benefit. I can give you some concrete example. We recently approved the Inga 3 project for DRC, right? But many were thinking, oh, it's the construction of the dam. No, the construction of the dam will come later. The investment that we have approved is to invest in the local population, to prepare the country and the local population to that big investment that will come. Because the lessons we've learned is that, you know, oftentimes we have these investments happening and the local population is not benefiting. Yeah. And here we are, before even the investment comes in, the private investment comes in, we are investing in road connectivity, electricity connectivity, education, health for the people, communities around the Inga site. That we think is very strategic in not only making sure that the local population will benefit, but also to de-risk the investment as well. So those are things that we are doing quite systematically now on some of those big transformative projects in some of these countries that have large natural resources.
I always really like how you have very comprehensive responses, but perhaps I will come with one to ask for a very specific point. What area of Africa's development has had the greatest success since 2000? And which critical levers must be prioritized to overcoming the remaining structural challenges to ensure that the development reach the expectations?
So look, what comes to mind really, and it was presented earlier by Chorching, is really this digital leapfrogging. I think that's very tangible. Many African countries, if not all African countries, have really made very, very significant progress in adopting and adapting technology, and even being innovative in some services using digital technology. And that is a booming sector in many African countries. So I think this is, and that has contributed to transforming African economies. The transformation, the overall structural transformation of Africa is slow, as was mentioned earlier. But at least one bright spot is what is happening in the sort of digital economy, the tech industry in general. And it's very inspiring, actually, throughout Africa to talk to young entrepreneurs in these areas. They are very, very innovative. They have great ideas. The challenge they have is to scale up. So most African startups don't scale up. We can talk about why, but this is something that needs really clear attention. I think it's related to the overall slowness of the growth in most countries, or growth that is really mostly driven by commodities. And in fact, if you look at overall economic growth, some countries are growing very fast, 6-7% per year. But that growth is mostly driven by commodities. It's not driven by sectors that could really generate massive amount of jobs to benefit local population. And this is, I think, what is happening in the digital economy is very promising, and we need to accelerate the structural transformation, similar to what we are seeing in the tech industry.
Amazing. I couldn't agree more. As a matter of fact, this is one of the topic covered in Foresight Africa 2025-2030, and it's also the topic of not just my second to most recent book, Africa's Fourth Industrial Revolution, but also of a book released by our Vice President here at the Global Economy and Development Program on industry without smokestacks, where ICT-based industry really represent the unique opportunity to serve as a development escalator for many African countries. Professor Adrien, so how can African states build a robust bureaucratic capacity to deliver better economic outcome in an environment where informality dominates economic life and direct taxation remain elusive? And this is particularly important as all the speakers today have highlighted the critical importance of state capacity, effective state capacity for successful delivery of public services and good.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of variation across the continent, so I don't want to, homogenize the landscape. But I think generally what we're dealing with at baseline is very low levels of trust in the formal state, high levels of sort of societal evasion, tax evasion, right? Resistance to formalization. And then also something that isn't mentioned in the report that I think is a really crucial ingredient of thinking about how to improve bureaucratic capacity of the formal state is the degree to which the informal economy is already governed by non-state actors. So, we have a vast sort of sector doing non-state services provision. And then in sub-Saharan Africa, we really have baked in to the constitutions of these countries a form of hybrid governance. So, we have traditional authorities. We have a whole set of actors that my co-author, Jessica Gottlieb, and I call social intermediaries. These actors have capacity. They're already extracting revenue. They're already delivering services. And they're already brokering exchange between citizens and states. So, when we talk about how to actually increase state penetration and improve bureaucratic capacity, we have to actually think about this institutional landscape to a degree that I don't think we have. So I did want to talk about the kinds of public policies that we're putting in place for formalization and tax compliance. There are best practices, and I was very pleased that the report sort of urged us to think beyond best practices, because I think the track record on our supposed best practices in terms of tax mobilization is not great. So, there have been several recent meta-analyses of formalization efforts, and these largely consist of either lowering barriers to registration, doing a lot more informational and nudge kinds of interventions, or maybe even directly incentivizing firms to formalize. And what we know from the track record on this is it's not really, it's mixed, but it's trending towards poor. And a lot of the times we do invest a lot of money in getting firms to formalize and only to see them fall back into informality pretty quickly, or for that formalization to not result in tax revenues. On the property tax front, the World Bank has been doing a lot on the assembly and digitization of cadastral maps. There's mixed opinion on this. I'm not a fan. I feel, and it's not just the World Bank that's doing this, African governments, I think, are also putting a lot of faith in really high-tech solutions to mapping and assessment. It's very expensive. And the empirical record that we've seen on these interventions, they do have positive gains, but from very low property tax compliance rates. So, I don't think that's going to be transformational. I do think that there are things that we can do. So, I recently spent a week in Kaduna State with a World Bank evaluation project on their property tax intervention. And for me, the most exciting public policy intervention that I saw in Kaduna State involved the Kaduna Environmental Protection Agency, a van, a desk, and a judge's chair, in which they were just trying to improve on the ground public perception of enforcement in environmental, regulation. And, I have to sort of do a shout out to Lagos State government. We've been working closely on a field experiment intended to increase tax compliance in the informal sector in Lagos with Lagos Internal Revenue. And what I think is really incredible about that agency is the degree to which, it's been successful in the formal sector, less successful, but some modest gains in the informal sector. But what you see there is a lot of policy innovation. They're willing to just throw stuff against the wall and see if it sticks. And the lack of sort of reliance on these traveling models or best practices that we try to import, I don't think those are going to work. Instead, I think what we need is really local innovation that grapples with this complex institutional framework and comes up with very local solutions on how to get governments to work, how to convince and persuade people to pay tax and to buy into this kind of social contract.
In alignment, and I connect to a question asked by the public, Andrea Buttositi, Senior Manager and Entrepreneurship Practice TechnoServe, what should the role of international NGOs at this particular moment be, especially in the context of Africa, and perhaps connected to strengthening capacity of state?
I mean, this is a tough question. And again, I do maybe have a controversial position on this. I think since economic structural adjustment, we saw a massive rollback of the state. And since this 2000 development report that we've all been talking about, the World Bank has changed direction on this and really recognized that states are going to be crucial partners in development. Now, international aid, NGOs, I think there is the possibility that it's actually crowding out the formal state. To the extent that we see services provision being done by NGOs, or in some places, for those of you who have spent time in Kenya, you go to a rural area and the local school is like co-branded, sort of United States flag, Kenyan flag. I worry that this does dampen, citizens' willingness to pay tax to local governments. And I do worry that can, make this kind of request on the part of African governments to pay tax a more difficult proposition. So I'm a little bit of an aid skeptic. I do think that there is a vital role played by local NGOs in really empowering communities to make demands and to be more involved and have capacity to really be involved in this development process. And I think that aid and international NGOs can assist in building that local capacity in civil society that's so important. But I think we do need to get away from sort of thinking of them as service and money providers.
No, I think that is an extremely important point to emphasize. So thank you so much, Professor Adrienne. Excellency, building on your impactful work as African Union Ambassador here in Washington, D.C., and looking ahead to the next 25 years, so how do you think that African countries can prioritize your key engagement policies to develop better relations whether with the United States, the multilaterals here, but also the diaspora?
Thank you, Professor Sinye. To begin with, we have to look at ourselves domestically. We have to have what it takes, which we put on the table, and say, here we are. For example, I'm looking at greening economies. And I'm saying, how does Africa not include its green economy into their GDP? And then they come to the table, it's the same, like, no, the countries don't have enough. They are not contributing enough. But if we include our green economies to what we are doing, our GDP, I think in 25 years, will be a force to reckon with at the end of the day. I would also look at Africa has a lot. A lot has been mentioned, but Africa has what it takes for them to be positioning themselves. As said in Agenda 2063, it's about building a prosperous Africa, peaceful, driven by its own citizens, and positioning itself in the global arena. A lot of things that we should do ourselves, having the Agenda 2063, having this active AFC FTA, we have to put it in practice right now and then push this integration that we're talking about. Let's have countries in those many regions on the continent working together in production of goods and the services. And I would say Africa has to put this on the incremental, the movement of people from one country to the other. As this drive of integration is taking place, there has to be free movement of the people. And if my brother may be coming from Ghana, I'm coming from Zimbabwe. He is also coming maybe from South Africa. What are we saying? The job is found it's in Zimbabwe. And he's coming from South Africa or he's coming from Ghana. That's our, that is our strength as Africa. We should accommodate such. Put on the table and say, we have an expert in 1, 2, 3. So I would look at, as we go out to talk to the international organization, our relations to the USA, we gotta be strong. I am looking for strength. I'm looking for, I note that, thank you. I'm looking for strength amongst ourselves by speaking with one voice. Be there, come together and they say, what are we worth? And this is what we put on the table as we are discussing with the international organizations. Thank you very much.
Amazing, Excellency. Now, I'm sure many people have so many questions in the audience. So if you have a question, okay, we'll take those 3 questions there. We'll take question by 3, and then, so, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Arthur from Rwanda. I have one quick question. I think for Africa to survive the next 25 years, we have to navigate through a new contestation on the continent between the global superpowers that are now flexing muscles on the continent. You've mentioned in her report, she mentioned about the new entrants, China, Russia, Middle East countries, but now also the US has a big interest on the continent. So how does Africa position itself to emerge out of this contestation? Previously it was Europeans under colonialism, but now it's a new dimension. How does Africa position itself to emerge out of this contestation successfully? And
one question. Thank you. So the next one, yes, you can go ahead.
So thank you very much for this discussion. So my question is related to trade integration. So your report mentioned that trade among African countries is still low, and it's mainly due to high trade and non-trade barriers, due also to the overlapping regional free trade areas. And my question is, what are the concrete actions that need to be done to accelerate the implementation of AfTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, to unlock the real potential of intra-African trade in our continent? Thank you.
And then the third question before we come back to the
Hi, my name is Kofi. I have a question regarding the insecurity on the continent. So in recent years, we've seen a lot of mass conflicts like Sudan, Ethiopia, Cameroon. So, but historically, across the world, war has been a way of state consolidation. And in the African context, state formation has not been organic. It's imposed by colonial powers. So without this organic state formation, do you see a trend of more conflicts in Africa? And is there really a possible way to make sure that development gains are not being pulled back by those conflicts? Thank you.
Thank you. So perhaps if you answer quickly in, let's say, in a minute, that will allow us to have many more questions. I start with you, Adrienne. More conflicts. So
yeah, Kofi, I'm so glad that someone asked a Charles Tilley question. So this sort of bellicist model of state building, this is the idea that in order to actually win wars, you need to build state capacity and especially mobilize revenue. And as Kofi pointed out, this is a model that's taken from Western Europe. But as Kofi pointed out, we don't see that kind of process going on. At least not really. I'll note that we didn't really see that process carry out in Latin America either. And so I think there are other pathways to state building. I think the real concern about rising disorder on the continent is not just about the big conflicts that we focus on. Those are important. But I think that we're also seeing a kind of erosion of very basic rule of law. And, a lot of that is about the rollback of the state and the rise of these non-state services providers. Some of those services providers are providing protection and security where the state isn't. And that's going to come with extortion. It's going to come with criminal economies. I'll also try to connect this to Arthur's question, the question about, I don't know our colleague's name, but the question about trade integration. I think that these barriers to trade do create opportunities for arbitrage, to the extent that there are, differences in prices of commodities across borders. This limits trade, but it also creates potential for criminal economies. So I think over the past 20 years, we have seen an explosion of those forms of sort of internal conflict and disorder. And we do need to really start thinking about how to roll that process back. and I don't have great ideas about this. My other book project, which isn't about tax, is about the involvement of a lot of vigilantes and other kinds of, I guess we'd call them agents of disorder in elections. So, I think that there is a question about the degree to which this disorder can be used as a tool by politicians to remain in power. So, I think that the incentives aren't really lining up, and we need some really innovative thinking about how to actually build functional states and create a better rule of law. But the trends are not positive in that direction, as the report points out.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And the question on trade, will you mind elaborating, Vice President Jammeh?
Sure. No, it's absolutely critical. I think if I think about growth accelerators or economic transformation accelerators in Africa in the next several decades, regional integration is one of them. As Ambassador was mentioning as well. Now, there's a framework. There's this Africa-wide free trade agreement, I think endorsed by most countries, if not all of them. The issue has been implementation. Yeah. If you look at the tariff and the non-tariff barriers, they're still very, very high. They are decreasing in some countries, and in some regional entities, you have more harmonization than in others. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to really incentivize the countries that have not really adjusted their barriers to do so. And I think right now, with the global context, I cannot just imagine a better context than now to do it because of what's happening globally. But I should also say that it's not just about the tariff and non-tariff barriers. It's also about infrastructure. Because without this infrastructure connectivity, Africa is not very well connected within. So to travel sometimes from one country to another, you have to go all the way to Europe and then go back down. So that is really not favorable for trade. So I think the infrastructure dimension, whether it's air transport, road transport, digital connectivity, and electricity connection, this is absolutely critical. Now, the bright spot that I see, especially in the eastern and southern part of Africa, especially in the southern part of Africa, is that trade in electricity is relatively advanced, right? It's not perfect. There are some issues, etc., but it's been progressing very, very well. And there's been quite a few investment in transmission across cross-border transmission. And that is really now translating in a broader scope of trade between countries. You see, for example, some countries that have surplus in hydro, selling electricity to countries that have deficits. And that interconnectivity, which is actually quite more expensive than I thought initially, I think is very promising. So we need to double down on that. And we need to also look at the strategic road corridors connecting countries to really invest in that, but also in the soft infrastructure, because one of the key challenges is just those roadblocks, which are related to security as well. And all of those, I think we all know what needs to happen. I think what is missing perhaps is the political will in some part in some countries to just do it in a bold way. But I think Africa has no choice, I think, if it wants to transform itself rapidly, than to really focus on regional integration. It's a really key opportunity.
Amazing. And Excellency, is there anything you want to add on that question? Or perhaps on how Africa can position itself given the global competition?
Okay, I'll answer.
Either. Either. You
had the tough one.
Okay. I would want to think that those challenges of the competition, the global competition, are also the challenges that we are already, giving us problems on the challenges on the continent, and which in some instances we cannot move due to such. But we know now, that's the good thing, is the reason I said it's all encompassing, if I may mention this. We have to domesticate our policies that we have come up with these policy frameworks that we've come up. Let's domesticate. I'll give you an example of the AFCFTA and the rules of origin. Mm-hmm. Yes, and when we, let's say I believe in examples, we're producing a product here, it should be able to go to Rwanda without any challenges because we're all members. We've all signed to the AFCFTA. We have maybe also all of us ratified, but I think there's need to domesticate because maybe the other end may say rules of origin cannot apply, but they should apply to AFCFTA members. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to, I think that one I've answered, asked it by, and when it comes to the global competition, when there's competition in your house, when the house is very vast and can fit everybody, everyone can fit in there. And when we have our policy frameworks, and we are saying this is who we are, this is Agenda 2063, this is our AFCFTA, this is the direction that we would want to take. For those who develop interest here and they believe in beneficiation for the goods that we have, minerals, these are the goods, but come in and set shop in Africa and not us taking there, which is still the domestication of the policies. You cannot take the raw materials and go and build outside, like the chocolate, the common one, the common example, which is chocolate. In countries that are developing the chocolate, don't have even a tree of chocolate out there, but they are the people who actually are making the chocolate. But let's set shop in Africa, yes, and allow the Africans also to enjoy what is theirs. And they know that it's coming from below. This is our environment, and this is what is coming from below. And this wasn't coming from our trees. And this is the process that we... And they teach those Africans to do the production process for them to come up with the final good or of the jewelry or for... So shops have to be set on the continent of Africa. And let's do beneficiation. I would want to think... I must have answered most of it.
Amazing, amazing. So let me take a final question or two. So I will take Sama, and then I will take the sir here.
Thank you, Professor Signé, and thank you to all of the to the presenter, Dr. Goh, and the panelists on this, thoughtful discussion on Africa's achievements and persistent structural challenges. One of the, data points that still stands out to me is Africa's huge import bill, especially its food import bill, which currently stands at between $60 to $100 billion. Given the geopolitical challenges we've seen around food insecurity, a war in Ukraine, and what we've seen with the wheat supplies, and given the fact that Africa has such huge untapped, uncultivated arable lands, and that agriculture stands as a big employer, given the challenges around jobs, what are the critical levers, in your view, that is required to really move away from this import dependency? Thank you.
And then the final question. Yes, him, just here.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. To what extent are you using the internet to raise funding and get transparency?
Amazing. So, distinguished speaker, you have the extremely important responsibility to keep us on time. So with 1 minute each, not more, and perhaps even one sentence or one word to close the session. So we'll start from here to there. So Professor Adrien.
The food bill. It's tough. I think, first of all, a lot of the agricultural production on the continent hasn't really been able to take advantage of green revolution technologies. And I think part of that is because of the rollback of the state. So, when I was living in Zimbabwe, there used to be an incredible agricultural extension program. It's still there to some extent in Zimbabwe, but not like it was in the 80s. And I think the same is true elsewhere on the continent. And so, the actual state presence, with the state presence going down, you don't have the ability for farmers to access improved seeds, other inputs. So, that's thing number one. Thing number two, as we rolled back the state, we got rid of grain marketing boards and other things that used to be doing all of the supply chain for farmers. And so I think the combination of those two factors means that a lot of the people working in the agricultural sector have gone back to more basic forms of production that don't yield enough food, also get the prices right. The prices are a mess.
Excellent. I want you to conclude. Perhaps, Excellency, do you want to say a word on any of those, or your final word?
My final word is the future is Africa. Let me say that.
Amazing. Isn't this beautiful?
Yes. Cannot be
Vice President Jani. But I thought you would have applaud for that. So now your final words are also.
No, I think the question asked by Osama is really critical. Agriculture and agriculture productivity. Africa hasn't done very well in this regard. If you look at the yield of many of the crops, you don't see this sort of very rapid increase that you can see in Vietnam or other countries. And in some cases, the yields now are the same as 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely critical to invest in agriculture. And in fact, it should be one of the first arrow in the structural transformation process. Because if you don't invest, agriculture is a sector where sooner or later people will leave that sector to go to other off-farm sectors or to urban areas for good reasons or bad reasons. For good reason, if you invest in mechanized agriculture and modernize agriculture, the number of people you will need to produce crops will decrease. And that's why in developed countries, very few people are producing massive amount of food for the whole world. So if you increase productivity, labor will leave agriculture. But unfortunately, in many African countries, labor is leaving agriculture for the wrong reason. Because the agriculture sector is neglected, not enough investment, or because of climate change. So it is so absolutely critical to address it because it translates into problems in urban areas. Right? So
amazing.
It is a strategic thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think, and that is why actually right now, the World Bank, IFC, and MIGA, we are working on a new framework to support countries in this area by really using a value chain approach and using the private sector, leveraging the private sector. Because what we see is that the traditional way of giving money to a Ministry of Agriculture to provide fertilizer and seeds to farmers doesn't work.
It's true.
It just doesn't. Yeah. So we are, trying to really do some things differently, but doing it in a bold way to help countries in Africa to really move to the next level when it comes to agriculture, because it's a priority.
This is a beautiful way to conclude this session. I want to express our deep gratitude to all of you who came to join us in person, but also all of you who are online, and to the incredibly amazing team who has supported, and the amazing people. And we see, for example, Dafe here, Izzy, Erin, and of course our leader Pierre, and many other from Global Comms and from Central Comms as well, who have supported this event. We are incredibly grateful. And this is the end. Please give another round of applause to our distinguished speaker and panelists. And to the panelists, you can stay seated, or you can stand up for a final picture.